Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another 50 Acres Academy webinar. Today's webinar is about planning for the 2016 federal election year, government relations. I don't know about you, but I'm sure everyone's feeling in the same way as I am, probably lurching from day to day, just making that final sort of run or sprint or perhaps crawling to the finish line as we get to the end of the year. But if you're all like any of my clients that we're currently working with, what's really interesting is that everyone is turning their attention to next year now that we have a new Prime Minister in tow. Obviously there's an election year coming up. So we're not sure when that's going to be, but we do know that it'll be next year. My bet would be on October, based on the recent by-election in North Sydney and the results there, but who knows? I think ultimately these things are often decided on all sorts of bases, usually polling, but not exclusively. So who knows where we'll go, but we know that we will have one. So let's have a think about what we're going to do to get ourselves organised. Before we get going, there is you can ask questions at any time. Just pop a question into the question box and I'll respond to them as we go through. So that's totally fine. And these this webinar will be up on the 50 Acres TV website after this, later on this afternoon. So please don't hesitate going on there and having a look. If you need to jump out at any stage early, it'll be there, the recording. And we'll also be sending through the slide pack to people as well, so you can have that as well, which is great. So let's think about what we need to think about today, planning for the next election year. So obviously we know it's scheduled for next year. We don't know when it's going to be, but I think the thing that we do know is that it's important to have a think about what to. So I'm just going to turn my email off while we're thinking about it. Sorry. What I do think we need to think about, is starting to plan. So what we're going to cover today is how to determine your government engagement objectives and priorities, what's achievable based on what you think you need to do next year, what success looks like for you, how to best target your activities over the next 6 to 12 months, because we don't really know whether it's going to be an election in March, April, or later in the year. And who are the key players as we approach the next election in the government, opposition, and crossbench. Sorry, my computer is being a bit weird today. I think it reflects everyone's state of mind, perhaps mine. So we're heading to an election. It's a big event. It's going to be a big event for Malcolm Turnbull. He's going to want to make his mark, and obviously they're going to not want to lose many seats, but it's inevitable probably that the government will lose some seats going into an election. But based on the fact that we're heading into an election, how do we determine what your objectives are and what is achievable for you, your organisation, or your company? Now, I don't know. I'm assuming that most of you are from not-for-profits, but there may be some of you listening who are either, just individuals interested in this or working for companies or corporates. So this is really equally applicable to anyone, whether or not you're in a company or whether you're working for an organisation or not-for-profit. So I think the first thing to do, approaching any sort of government relations program, and even 6 months out from an election, it's no different really. You really need to plan what it is you're wanting to achieve. There's no point in going into a panic mode because there's an election coming up. Yep, it's an election, but it really shouldn't be anything really fundamentally different to any other year in terms of how you approach it strategically. So I think the thing that you need to think about are these key elements. So first of all, what's your operating environment? What do you, whether you're a corporate, is it issues? Is it about the market for you? Is it about, some legislative restrictions or things that you want changed? As a not-for-profit, is it about funding? Is it about direction, the government's direction in terms of policy? What's your objectives? Are they realistic, first of all? We understand that it's an election year. We can always ask for 23, an ambit claim of 23 requests to a minister or to a government, but it's unlikely that we're going to get them. So what is realistic? I was just on the phone a little bit earlier to a client, and we're dealing with some funding issues, and there's a possibility that they're going to be defunded, and at a state level, and it's what we're thinking is that the signals are pretty clear that they're going to be defunded. And so what do we do? Where do we put our priorities? Where do we put our energy? So we're moving our energy to a federal level. We're thinking about how we can make a media splash as we move towards the New South Wales budget. Making a statement in terms of saying, well, this is a service that's been funded for a long time, and don't let that go unrecognised, but also making sure that we spend our energy in the right way. So what is achievable for you? What is something that you think the government might do? We're in a very tight economic environment. There's a lot of talk about government cuts at the moment, budget cuts. There's talk about any spending has to be matched by budget cuts. It's pretty clear the signals that are coming out federally. So I think, one of the things that I would say to you if you're in a not-for-profit or an organisation is to come to government with, an ask or a request about something that is either budget neutral or requires their involvement or their partnership, perhaps in the first instance, them signing on to something that you're doing sort of a spirit of cooperation necessarily than wanting a lot of funding. Now that's not a nice thing to hear, but ultimately it's probably something that you need to consider. And if funding is something that you've got to go to them with, think about how you can go to them and say, this is going to be a creative funding solution. We're also looking at identifying philanthropic funding sources, some social enterprise initiatives, other corporate investment. Go to them with a mixed funding model and saying, we're not just coming to government asking for, you to just give us our entire funding needs, which I think is at this current point in time. And in fact, I think as far as we going forward, I really don't think that's going to be the way governments are going to want to look at not-for-profits any longer. Unfortunately, to some extent, but fortunately in some other ways, it actually means that I think not-for-profits then have to become more autonomous and more independent of government, which I think is ultimately probably a good thing. Moving on to targets, what else you need to think about when you're planning? What are the targets? Who are the individuals, the groups, the external, the internal groups, both within the parliament, but also the others that might be coming into play with anything that you might be doing? How can you weave in some of the third-party supporters that may lend an ear or lend support when talking to government? What are the messages that you're going to government with? Are you encouraging them to do something? Are you wanting them to change their mind about something? Do you just want to educate them? Or are you just trying to inform them about what it is that you do? How are you going to communicate with them? We'll get to a bit about more detail about how we might do that in a moment. And, the engagement, government, an election year is important, but I really would say to you, the election year is not the only time you should be talking to government, and I'm sure most of you know that. But, this is 1 year in, many years. It's every 3 or 4 years that we have an election. There's a whole lot of other stuff they do in those other years as well, which we need to be thinking about. So, if this is the first time you're thinking about government engagement, think about a sort of sustained 24, 36-year plan and where this initial plan, planning might fit in. So what's the next year going to bring for your company or organisation? You need to think about these sorts of things. What are your specific objectives? How will you weave media into that? So if we're talking federally, how will you weave the press gallery into this equation in terms of anything you might be doing in Canberra? Is there a story there that they can get on, that they can get onto? Is there something that's photographic that can be photographed or filmed? What are the options? How can you engage third-party supporters, other influencers, celebrities, or public, or the public, community, your supporters, your members, in anything you're doing down in Canberra? Is there an opportunity for people to get involved? Is there an opportunity for you to have a third-party supporter or an influencer or celebrity down at an event, for example, in Canberra, or when you're talking to federal influencers and federal decision makers? This is a planning matrix. You'll get these slides later in the day, and they'll so you can print this out. I mean, this is just a suggestion in terms of something that you can do. But what's the timing? Thinking about now. What are the targets for the objective? What are the objectives, and what are your messages? You can map this out for yourself, and there's obviously lots of other criteria that you can think about as well. So ultimately, it's about people and punters and voting, and we need to think about how we're going to get through to the politicians to make them understand that you're representing a meaningful agenda, whatever that is. So how do you make the approach? What do you do to move this forward? Now, many of you might know about all this and have done this. My apologies if this is teaching you how to suck eggs a little bit better than you currently do, but some people who've never put their toe in the water in terms of government engagement, this might be helpful. So obviously meeting in person with government people is really effective, and it's they're often very busy. There's a number of ways in which you can maximise the likelihood that they'll make time to meet with you, and let's have a think about how that might be done. So the things that you need to consider are, when you're meeting with people in the government position, crossbench, is who's going to have influence over the outcome you're hoping to achieve? Is it solely the government's domain? Is it something that the opposition can influence? Is it something that the crossbench can articulate in one of the chambers or in a media event with you? These people need to become your targets for a meeting request and engagement. You can find the phone contact details for all federal MPs, state MPs on the websites that you need to engage with. You just do a Google search, and for the federal government, it's aph.gov.au. The second thing to consider is how each target might be able to assist you. This becomes your ask, and we'll talk more about that in a second, but though it's best not to mention this directly when you first request the meeting, what we tend to do is really talking broadly about the issue that you're wanting to talk about rather than the specifics of the request. There's a couple of reasons why not to do that. If you specifically outline exactly what you're wanting, you're letting the cat out of the bag before you get to the meeting. You allow the person to be prepared for that. They're politicians. They usually can guess what you're there for, but ultimately it's useful to have some sort of element of surprise and a sort of freshness to the meeting. If you outline everything you're going to say to them in some sort of briefing note, they've read that, they're completely prepped, and they're just going to give you formulaic responses. What I tend to like to do with MPs and in particular their advisors is allow that dynamism to develop in a discussion. And so, really just give them, we always get asked, always, for what's the agenda, can you send us some details or a detailed briefing note? We'll always send them a briefing note about a client, but we won't usually, unless there's some really good reason for it, unless it's a very detailed budget discussion, we know that it's a very detailed discussion and it's a significantly progressed discussion. But if it's an initial discussion, we will never give that element of surprise up before the meeting starts. We'll just say we want to discuss some broad, funding issues or some broad fund policy issues around the blah, blah, blah. And we don't usually use coloured language like, concerns or whatever. We don't want to preempt the discussion and give an indication that it's going to be aggressive or not optimistic or positive. So I think it's important not to preempt and let them judge you in terms of what that meeting is going to be like. I think it's best to be neutral when you do approach people in the first instance. So after you then sent out the invitations, what do? Well, you put in a call to each office on your target list. You may need to do that many, many times. And, a lot of people will say to me, or, when I talk to others, where are you up to? If I've spoken to a client who's tried to progress some invitations themselves, they'll go, oh, yes, we sent them a letter. And I go, okay, and what else did you do? And they went, well, we've sent them a letter, and that's it. And a lot of people, and maybe that's just, maybe it's sort of, they're still, aficionados of old technology. But essentially, I think you need to realize how busy people are, how much pressure there is on them, how many people are asking them to do things all the time. And on a sitting day, for example, I used to, when I worked for a minister, I'd get in for a staff meeting at 6 or 6:30 in the morning, and I'd get home at 11 o'clock at night. I lived just sort of half an hour out of Canberra, and I had 2 kids. It was a sort of a quietly insane place to be working. It's why I left after the first 3 years of the Rudd government. But it's a very pressurized environment. There's not a lot of time to think and function. So, I think it is important to understand that you have to keep ringing to get these meetings. Ringing them in non-sitting weeks to organise the meetings is the best thing to do, rather than ringing them at 1 o'clock on a sitting day when their minister's going into question time in an hour, and they're just focused on the minister running around yelling out about what, he or she needing more information about a particular issue. Not a good time to call. In fact, sitting days to organise meetings are not the best times to call. You can email people, and obviously, I don't know how you personally approach things, but I tend to, in all things, whether it's trying to get a refund on something or whether it's trying to find out some information about something, often these days you have to repeatedly email people because you need to be at the top of their inbox. So, these people are no different. In fact, they're probably in a much more difficult situation in terms of being time poor. It's not that they want to ignore you, they just have got a lot of stuff on their plate. And in fact, in the last sort of 5.5 years since we've started 50 Acres, we haven't, I think, got one knockback for a meeting with an office. We may not have got the Prime Minister, but we've got the, advisor to the Prime Minister. And even on, for example, we had Girl Guides in the building on the day that there was the Turnbull Challenge against Abbott. We had something like 52 meetings organised that day, and I think only one was cancelled, and it wasn't because of the challenge. So, generally speaking, people are pretty good at giving you time. They're pretty good at looking at a meeting and keeping it. It's just about persisting until you get that meeting sorted out. So, what we tend to do is send a simple email outlining the reason for requesting a meeting, indicating an indicative time frame. Make it as broad as possible. Don't say, I can meet you at 2 o'clock on Wednesday the 22nd of blah, 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 or 3 p.m. on the, my advice is to say, week commencing, I am available, we are available, week commencing blah, week commencing blah, and week commencing blah. Give them 3 weeks. And there's no excuse then. They've got a fully open diary. It's much easier than them. You can imagine when someone comes to you with a very specific time, it's hard to lock that down. So if you go to them with a much more open time, and I will often have clients say to me, oh, well, I've got an immovable thing here on the 23rd. And I go, we're trying to get a meeting with the Treasurer. I reckon the Treasurer is probably busier than you. I don't obviously say it rudely, but, you've got to be, you've got to then, if you're working for someone who's a chair or a CEO, or you're a CEO yourself, you've just got to realise that you have to drop stuff to fit in with these people because they are busier than you. And, maybe if they're not, they're more important in the context of you need the meeting. They don't have to give it to you and you're asking for it. So it's really about you being flexible. You then need to follow up, as I said, with a lot of phone calls. Keep going, don't give up, and eventually you will succeed. Is my mantra. So here's some hints about what the email could contain. I won't go into much detail with that, but here is some suggestions. You can download this later in terms of some thoughts about what the email might look like. So, as I said, provide a whole lot of dates. I always suggest asking to meet an MP or an advisor. I actually think it's better in some respects to meet an advisor because you get a much more honest, eyes wide open, seeing the whites of their eyes sort of response, I think, than you do with the MP, who is like a performing seal and often will just give you that sort of lovely, jubbly, firm handshake, positive, upward and onward. Yep, lovely to see you. In the door, out the door. That's great. Another one over. You can often get a much more honest approach, I think, and a much more honest appraisal of the situation from an advisor. So I would say meet an advisor first if you're thinking about doing a sustained couple of rounds of meetings next year. I would start with advisors, certainly in ministers' offices, not just go to the ministers and say, I want to meet with the Prime Minister, the Treasurer and the Social Security Minister, and that's it. I'm not going to accept anything else. I think it's about being open to meeting an advisor. Certainly you could possibly get a lot more information that way. So what's your engagement checklist before you start? Create a target list, be clear, concise and polite and persistent in terms of your approaches. Outline why the issue is relevant to them. Consider requesting a meeting with an advisor. I think that's a great idea, and provide a range of dates, weeks that you are available. Be as broad as possible with your availability. So next then you need to think about is tactics, understanding that there's a whole range of stakeholder engagement. It's not necessarily just meetings. You might be able to appear before a committee next year. You might be able to meet someone at an event. You might ask them to come to an event of yours. You might be in an event where someone is there. What I would say to ensure is that if you're standing an event and there's an MP there, and you know that there's an MP there, it's not the time to present a sort of treatise of your demands or your objectives, or hand them over your annual report and a list of your ambit claim of what you're wanting to see them about at a meeting in a couple of months' time. It's a time to engage and to establish a rapport and to be a normal human being. That's what they're looking for. They're not really looking for a whole list of imposts, because what will happen is you'll hand them something, will just get handed straight to an advisor, or they won't look at it. They'll take it back to the office. It'll be given to someone else and they won't be interested. But what they will remember is that you're a human being, that you had a good sense of humour, that you're able to connect with them at that moment, and as a consequence, may be more receptive to you, or their office may be more receptive to you when you approach them. And I think that's the key to it. If a minister is at an event and you talk to them and they're standing with an advisor, make sure you get the advisor's name. It's the advisor that's your link to, a potential meeting. You're not going to be able to email the minister and ask them for a meeting. So, the advisor is your chink of light into that office. Make sure that you have your research sorted. It's very important. And make sure before you go into a meeting that you know about who you're meeting, what they're thinking, so that if I couldn't count on 100 hands and toes and fingers how many times I've been into a meeting and we've gone in there with an objective with 3 or 4 key messages or things that we wanted to raise, and the minister or the MP's has gone off on a bit of a tangent on just was wandering down the office today and I saw this, or have you thought about that, or did you see this in the news, in the media this morning, or it's whatever. They're human too. They often have things that they're finding passionate at the time, that they're angry about, that they're happy about, that they're sad about. And so, if an MP or a minister goes off on a tangent, go off on a tangent with them for a minute or two. Be mindful to bring the meeting back, but obviously, being aware of what it is they're likely to be angry or sad or passionate about is helpful. If you're going to meet them and you're from a health charity and it's an issue that they've got a connection to because someone in their family has had that disease or that problem, then know that and have that there to be able to be woven into the conversation. So these are some of the things that you need to think about in terms of tactics. There are obviously other options in terms of meetings, parliamentary hearings and committees that you might be able to be part of, and informal contact, which we've just talked about. So what's the big picture in terms of where you might go with this? I think you need to think about, what's achievable. What does success look like? We'll get to that in a second. Understanding the operating environment, particularly of them. What is the stresses that they're under at the moment? Being realistic in the engagement, but don't underplay your hand. Don't, go in there and go, I'm not here to ask anything. I'm just here to talk to you. Ultimately, an MP, most of them will say, how can I help? Most of them are under the pump, and more than anything these days, we often go into meetings and the first question or second question is, how can I help? What am I here? What are you here to ask me for today? And you have to have something to say to that question. So you need to not just say, oh, actually, we just wanted to see what the office is like. You need to have something to say, something intelligent to bring in at that point. So what are your objectives? We did start by saying that, but think about what that might look like. Is it about a change in policy? Is it about asking for funding? How will you do that realistically in this environment? You need to think about that. What's the game plan? What is it that you want to achieve? Or what does success look like in terms of your achievements? Because if your achievements are getting 100% funding, well, you're not going to get it. So, well, I doubt it. So you need to think about what's the worst case scenario that might represent some form of success, and have a sort of a moderated sort of a approach to what success might look like for you and your organisation. Research and preparation is really important, as I've just mentioned. It's about knowing what they think about, whether they're under any personal stresses themselves, how are they, what's going on in their own lives. So reading about them before you get to the meeting is important. What are your asks? We did talk about that a second ago. We need to make sure that it is realistic, but you need to have something to ask them. You need to talk to them, even if it's about, what do you think about this? Where do you think the government's going? What we'd like is this, but what do you think is realistic? You don't have to pose it in a sort of a threatening and aggressive way. It's not that we want all letterboxes painted green in 2016. It's not that. It's not about necessarily an absolute ask. It's about having something cogent to contribute to a discussion that makes them talk. The key in a meeting is to get them to engage. If you just talk at them, it's an easy meeting for them. They don't have to give you much. They just have to sit there and smile. But if you ask them a question, what do you think is going to happen? Where do you think this is going to go? What do you think the Prime Minister thinks about this? What do you think might happen in terms of this piece of legislation? They're going to have to say something to you. They might fudge it, but you never know. You might get them to be honest, and that would be great. So background materials. Sometimes you can send a letter or a background brief if you want to about your organisation, but don't say too much. A leave behind, I think, is a really good thing to have in terms of embracing some social impact evaluations or some testimonials that you might be able to weave in. Using infographics, I think, is a really, really good thing to do. And if people haven't done that, I'd certainly look at getting those professionally done. Or if you don't have the capability of doing them in-house, outsourcing that. But it is something that is usually really well received. You can imagine if you're handing a politician this rather than a written document, it's much easier for them to look at it, get an emotional sort of read off it. They can look at it and talk to you at the same time. Whereas if they get a written brief handed to them in a meeting, they're distracted. They'll read it and at the same time trying to talk to you, and most people can't walk and chew gum, and so I think it is important to keep anything you hand them really simple in a meeting, and an infographic is something that you could hand over during the meeting if you wanted to be quite impactful about what it is you're trying to achieve. Follow up and review. Now, yes, we're dealing with an election year, but following up is very important because, so often I've had people say to me, we had a great meeting, we always get the meetings that we've asked for, but they don't go anywhere. The reason for that is that you don't follow up adequately. Again, the people that you're meeting with, whether it's an advisor, whether it's a departmental person, or whether it's a minister, they're all busy. They've got lots of other people. They've had 23 other meetings this week. Everyone's asking them for stuff. Everyone's asking them to do things. They've got a lot of things on their to-do list. So you too have to, batten down the hatches and make sure that you're in that the top of the inbox to get your stuff done or your stuff responded to. So, it is an ongoing process. It is something that you might be initiating in the election year, but I think it's something that you need to be able to think, okay, this is the beginning of a relationship. It's not just a moment in time. It's something that's ongoing, and it's really important to think about that. What are the next touch points that you might be able to do? Is it going to be a second meeting before the election? Is it something that is it something that they want from you? Is there a particular policy area that you could help them with in terms of, the opposition or the government policies stance on something? Giving them anything that they need via email very quickly after the meeting, and a thank you is always really important. So the other thing that I think it's really important to think about in the context of any government engagement next year is making sure that it's part of your overall communications outreach. There's not a lot of point, obviously there's occasional times where you're going to be engaging with government where you don't want the media to know about it, but a lot of times in a government, in an election year, it is a public process, it's a lobbying process. And so thinking about your strategy, your media strategy in the context of your government engagement, I think is really important for next year as well. So what do you need to think about in terms of communications? You need to think about who are we talking to, how do we reach them? You're not just talking to the politician in the room. There's an objective beyond that. There's an objective. You're trying to change something, get them to do something that they're not doing now, get them to stop doing something that they're doing now, get them to fund something, get them to come on board, get them to cooperate with you, whatever it is. But ultimately, you're trying to reach someone beyond that room. And so who are those people? How else will you tell them about the activities that you've been engaging with in government? So how do you reach them? What are you going to say to them? And what's the method you're going to use to say it to them? What do you want them to do? So what do you want, your third-party supporters or your stakeholders or the public, the general community, what do you want them to do? Do you want them to sign a petition? Do you want them to tweet some support? Do you want them to go onto Facebook and endorse you? Do you want them to give you some money? What is the action that is involved here if you're a not-for-profit? And, if you're a corporate, you probably have a slightly different approach to this, but certainly if you're a not-for-profit or an organisation, there's a lot of things that you could ask your stakeholders to do for you. How might you talk about this? What opportunities might come out of events that you might hold in an election year? What other platforms might you use in terms of social media, for example? What's your social media strategy? Because it's really important to make sure that that's woven in. Again, so many people in Parliament love being able to sort of put pictures of the fact that they, met with you. You can all retweet each other's sort of endorsements and statements. It's really important that you do that and make sure that you are sort of fully up to speed on how you can use social media when you are engaging with people next year. So in terms of Canberra, the Turnbull government obviously has a large majority in the House of Representatives, but it doesn't control the Senate, as we know. It's got a large number of experienced ministers who've been in the Parliament for a long time. It needs to demonstrate fiscal conservatism, and they're likely to look favourably on initiatives that incorporate an enterprise element and demonstrate independent revenue streams, as we talked about earlier. It's obviously the government has strong allies in the business community. So we talked a little bit about the environment in the building, and it's sort of crazy, and we all know that. I think you probably get that, but it is really quite insane, and it's really important to keep that in mind. Who are the key players? Well, we know in terms of an issue, you obviously need to identify the minister, the shadow minister, any key committees, the chairs of those committees, the members of all of those committees, and broaden that out. So if it's a health issue, it might have an economic impact. If what you're asking for happens, there's also an economic impact, a positive economic impact that may roll on as a consequence, that might be reduced government spending if they take action. I did some work with the Jodie Lee Foundation, and they're a bowel cancer awareness charity, and it's a no-brainer. One of the reasons why they've got sustained funding is because, every case that they prevent of bowel cancer, I think it's something like a $40,000 or $50,000 saving as a minimum to government. It's a no-brainer. The kits for bowel cancer prevention cost $25 from a chemist, and 90% of cases can be stopped if people test frequently and early enough. So there's an economic argument that you can advance there, and I think it's about making sure that you can have those, economic arguments, and you can put them, to people such as committee members, such as chairs of committees, to the shadow ministers, to the ministers, more importantly to their staff, and getting through to the staff. So that's, obviously important. Don't disregard the crossbench. In fact, don't disregard any of them at all, making sure, I would suggest, if it's a broad issue, if it's a broad campaign that you're waging between now and the election, have them all on your list. Everyone in the crossbench in the Senate, everyone in the crossbench in the House of Representatives, and reach out to each and every office. And even if you get just a meeting with a staff member rather than a member of Parliament themselves, that's an achievement. And it means that you're well networked. There are some that are better at this than others. Nick Xenophon is particularly good at coming up in the middle ground and negotiating an outcome. He's a great operator, and he's just started his own party, and he's going to be fielding candidates all over the country come the election. He's a real force to be reckoned with, and I find him very approachable. He's got a mind as sharp as, attack is extraordinary, and he is a good ally. And if you only got time to do 1 or 2 meetings in the Senate crossbench, he and the Greens are obviously the ones that I would suggest you do. But I really would suggest meeting each and every one of them, because you just never know what's going to resonate with someone. Jackie Lambie's certainly got men's mental health and men's health and drug rehab issues on her agenda. She's got a son who has been in and out of drug rehabilitation, and is very open about talking about it. So you never know sometimes until you get to the meeting or the engagement what's going to connect with them. So I really would urge you to go and talk to every member of the Senate or their officers, even if you think that they're a little bit out there or their agendas aren't going to coincide with yours, or that you don't agree with their values. They have a vote, they have a voice. More importantly, they can grab some of that attention, and in an election year, the media are duty bound to make sure that they get some of that voice space. And so more importantly than any other time, an election year and an election campaign is really important for you to have some of those crossbenchers in your hip pocket, or sort of up your sleeve, that you can go, I've got a relationship that I've established with Kai Palmer or whoever it is. Let's see whether I can get them engaged with my issue during the election campaign itself, or in some way this year. And I think that's really well worth thinking about. So key influence, we've spoken about that. There's government, there's opposition, there's crossbench. Don't forget the staff, and don't forget departments, the agencies and the officials. Though obviously, most government officials, as they head into an election year, it's actually an opportunity for them to do less. They do have to, prepare stuff. But when they go into the election itself, they're in caretaker mode and they're sort of hands off. So, this year more than any year, yes, you can get often a really good read, an accurate read about what might be happening within Parliament from departmental officials or agencies. But as we get closer to an election, they'll be less willing to tell you honestly what they think is happening. So just bear in mind that very much the power balance, the fulcrum of power, shifts really back into the building and the people who are in the building, the government itself, or the opposition, etc., the crossbench. So I don't know about you, but I'm hoping this is the end of the session. If anyone's got any questions, please don't hesitate popping them in now. We're just about to wind up. This is my wish of good cheer and a rest for everyone. I hope you all get to lie on a beach or a river or do something that's beautiful and lovely and restful, reading, eating, sleeping, whatever it is that you're doing. I hope you enjoy it and have a great holiday. The next webinar won't be until February. I thought probably not a lot of you doing one next month because a lot of people will be doing exactly that, sunning themselves. So the next one will be in February, on February the 16th, about digital marketing and campaigning, the sort of platforms and the how-tos. Again, election year, it's a useful thing to be able to be thinking about. They're low budget, they're low cost, and there's all sorts of different things that you can be thinking about in terms of low budget digital marketing and campaigning tools. So thanks so much, everyone. It was great to have you all joining us today, and have an enjoyable, restful, and very peaceful and safe Christmas, New Year, and holiday period. Thanks again. Thanks for joining us.